The comments, opinions, and views shared during this program are of those individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, Masonic Authority, or craftsmanonline.com.
Welcome back to our countdown of the most listened to Craftsman Online podcast episodes for 2023. Our year-end tradition continues as we stack the episode download data from January 1st, 2023, and make our way to the most listened to episode of this year. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, and along the way, we're going to listen to the conversations and discussions with our guests who made the list. And don't forget, after we hit number 1, you can join me to kick off the 4th season of the Craftsman Online podcast. That starts Monday, January 8th. Before we get started, let's take a quick look back at our top 10 list so far.
Number 10.
The Moon Knight with Worshipful Brother Wes Latchford.
Number 9.
My Masonic Journey featuring Brother Luis Diaz.
Number 8.
Journey into an 18th century Egyptian Rite Lodge hosted by Brother Angel Millar.
Number 7.
The Secret School of Wisdom with Brother Joe Wages.
Number 6.
Hiram Abiff, the man, the myth, and the legend with Brother David DeHaasen. And that brings us to...
Number 5.
This year, Craftsman Online has added Brother Jason Short to our reading room programs, and he's also signed on as a regular contributor to our blog at craftsmanonline.com. And here's why. Brother Short continues to amaze when he shares his work in researching the biblical connections in the first degree of Freemasonry. On the 5th most listened to episode of the Craftsman Online podcast in 2023, Brother Jason explains how Masonic keystones provide more than a rite of passage. They're the steps that lead to self-improvement.
So the Masonic breadcrumbs, which we're alluding to here, I speculate were encoded into our rituals, crafting them not as merely rites of passages, but treasure maps, which lead us to discover specific ancient mysteries and gems of wisdom, which you needed a key to decipher. These are like lessons that unlock not only a better understanding of what it means to be a man and a Mason, but also like knowledge that's needed in order to advance to the preceding degrees. And I've been calling these breadcrumbs Masonic keystones in like the operative craft, the stone which holds, at the apex of an archway holds it together. These Masonic keystones are things that bridge the gap to our comprehension. They bridge the gap between the esoteric and the exoteric to our modern understanding to the ancient wisdom of our ancestors.
It's interesting because moving into the next or another body of Freemasonry, the keystone is very prominent in chapter in the Royal Arch. So that caught my attention. But the way that you've described it, very eloquent, and I think also applies to what the York Rite intents and purposes are as well. So for our listener, whether you have chapter experience or not, when we talk about keystones, these are the ideas that Brother Short has identified, and you've specifically narrowed down on 7 of them, which are metal, naked nor clothed, barefoot nor shod, left, hoodwinked, cable toe, and 3 distinct knocks. For some weird reason, I feel like a host of Jeopardy when I read those, as those might be the categories for the game that we're going to play. That's a very distinct set of keywords that do appear several times throughout the ritual. How did these 7 words appeal to you? How did you select them as you were searching the volume of sacred law?
It made sense to me to focus on a section of the ritual that every initiated brother is going to experience. How a candidate is prepared across jurisdictions is perfect, not only because we can all really relate to that, but it presented a pattern. And for any brethren who want to explore the ritual deeper, the same way that I've been jumping through it, patterns are sort of the key to deciphering the ritual and looking within the pages of the Great Light. So in some shape or form, these 7 keywords or this presentation of how a candidate is prepared in all 3 decrees we encounter. I think the other thing that I found really cool about these 7 keystones is these are what we encounter before we enter the room. Digging into them you actually uncover pretty much an entire foundation of what our craft is built on. And you can find not only the passwords and a word, lessons which lead to the preceding degrees, all before a candidate even enters the room, which is really cool.
Now, I know that your other profession is not a monk. So I'm curious what technology or tools or resources you've already done the work. Brothers are going to go be able to read your 20-page research paper. But if they wanted to search these terms in their volume of Sacred Law or Bible at their home, please tell me you didn't go page through page with like 7 different color highlighters.
Oh man, I really wish I did. But for me, it was instrumental to be able to use digital copies of the King James Bible, of the New International Version of the Bible, of the Torah, of the Tanakh, pretty much any biblical text or volume of sacred law. These days, you can get as a PDF. I personally downloaded and was able to then explore these texts this way. It takes you to these really amazing passages. And the point with all of this isn't just to find and extract a single word and where that's from. The point is to get the overall of where and why these words are presented. What is the teaching that this alludes to? What role does that play in your life?
Not only is the work beautifully explained, but as you'll see, he sources a lot of this material. So let's start with Boaz. Our listener might be familiar with him as being known as the pillar of strength. There's a reference there. Expand a little bit more on the Hebrew meaning of Boaz. I found this really interesting, especially the deeper significance of that reference when it comes to Freemasonry and Masonic ritual.
The original Hebrew translation of Boaz does mean in him is strength. As the pillar is positioned as the left pillar, or in the newer translations of the Bible, it's actually the north pillar. It is Boaz, opposite from the south pillar or the right pillar, whose name means he will establish. And the Hebrew translation of that name, he is meant to infer God. And when paired together and read symbolically as you would read Hebrew, it says, he will establish strength within. And these two pillars, every brother who walks into the temple walks between these two pillars. There's something to be said about the lineage. There's something to be said about where we came from and the nature versus nurture. And a part of me really likes to hold on to this idea that it wasn't just by chance or by translation of the Hebrew word that Solomon had decided to name the pillar Boaz in honoring their grandfather. They also saw their grandfather as being a pillar of who they were.
Number 4.
The Haramic legend is among the oldest and most dearest myths of the human race. As Brother Carl Claudy noted, quote, "The Haramic legend is the glory of Freemasonry. The search for which that was lost is the glory of life," end quote. On the 4th most listened to Craftsman Online podcast episode of 2023, we reached out to Right Worshipful Samuel Lloyd Kinsey, chairman of the Custodians of the Work Committee for the Grand Lodge of New York, to add his interpretations on the deeper meanings of the Haramic drama in Masonic ritual. And we're happy to also have you on our website at craftsmanonline.com. We've created the Custodians Corner where you can pose questions that you have about Masonic ritual and have them answered. I've always wondered this myself, where our Masonic ritual really feels like two halves to a completely different football game. In the first half, where you have the obligation and what really does feel like a ritual. And then in the second half, especially when we get to the Haramic legend, that does feel like you're watching a play, be it dinner theater or an off-Broadway show. How did that come about?
If we really look at, and that's a perfect analysis of sort of how our rituals work, they all do have a fairly similar first section. The funny clothes walking around blindfolded sections, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And those are really the oldest parts of the degree, right? I mean, if you look at the historical record that we have of what Freemasons were doing in, let's say, Scotland in the late 17th century, the ceremonies were very brief, but they did have the walking around, and so there's a fundamental similarity there. And then as the transition over to speculative masonry happened, right, there over the course of the 18th century, there was this huge expansion of the Masonic ritual. And that's where we get all of that second half stuff, which I like to describe as sort of elucidating lectures and demonstrations.
As someone who has the role of caretaker for our ritual today, as the chairman of the custodians of the work, and just as a Masonic brother, what is your interpretation of Hiram? Who is this guy?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't want to make anybody mad. One of the great things about Masonry is speculation, right? Which makes it possible for us to sort of conjure things out of the ritual that we have, right? I actually have a paper that I wrote about called The Three Levels of Masonic Meaning. Level 1, this is what the ritual actually says. Level 2 is factual knowledge that you can get, which is almost infinite, right? I mean, it could literally be, what was the political situation when this came about? For example, all the stuff about war in the Middle Chamber lecture entered the work right after the Civil War. That's why some of those musical pieces are in there that are a little bit mystifying, if you don't know that. So, and then there's speculation, which is basically stuff that people can layer on top of it, and interpretations. It's a little bit like looking at a painting, right? Sigmund Freud wrote a book about the interpretation of paintings. So you could interpret them that way, or you could look at the brushstrokes, or you could, there's a lot of different ways you can interpret a painting, and they could be actually diametrically opposed. Problem is that a lot of Masons, right, they go up to all these things and they like to tell people this is how it is, or that these are things that were deliberately put in there. I have a term for that. One of them is speculation, and the other one is bullshit. So, to me, Hiram represents the principles that he stood for. You think about the end of the Middle Chamber lecture where they talk about, this is a temple of honor, justice, of knowledge, where you talk about in the end of the soliloquy of Jubileum, when he talks about truth, honor, fortitude, and I think that he stands to a certain extent for loyalty and integrity unto death. I actually don't think that the lesson taught by the Hiramic legend is all that complicated. And as befits the youngest part of our ritual. And there's obviously lots of, little things that you can get out of it. But like, I could tell you something that I think is, more profound about the lesson that's being taught to us by the rough and the perfect Ashlar than necessarily, I think, it comes out of the drama as a first level meaning of that. So I think Hiram is who we should aspire to be.
Number 3.
As one of our most popular guests on the Craftsman Online podcast, it is no surprise that Brother John Nagy landed on our countdown for the second straight year. On the third most listened to Craftsman Online podcast episode of 2023, Brother John joined me for a candid conversation on what all candidates should be told, from their first inquiry into Freemasonry to their first lodge visit to waiting in the preparation room before each degree. We covered the important points we wish we were told ahead of taking our Masonic obligations.
I like enthusiastic people who absolutely drive the conversation because they have a burning desire to know more about what is being offered. The same thing applies to the craft. There are individuals who are seeking Freemasonic affiliation because they simply want the experience of going through the rituals. They're not looking to become part of the line. They're not looking for anything other than just the experience and the affiliation. And add to all that, that I like to tell interested parties that they're going to have to contend with a huge range of personalities. Ritualists, there are the esoterics, and you got a whole range of different interests. And each one of these members have their own focus and their own set of values as to what's important and what could be basically put by the wayside. I tell them in every single ceremony that they're going to go through, if they go through the first three, the Blue Lodge degrees, they're going to be asked to do specific things and answer specific questions during the ceremony, and to always answer from your heart. And this is what I tell them before a petition even comes into the discussion.
Now let's talk about them becoming a member. And this is a conversation that you and I have had, because there have been times where I felt like maybe I stepped over the line a little bit in preparing a candidate on what you should, or well, let's just start there. What you should tell them. You have a gentleman who's standing outside the door, who's ready to take the knocks to come in and take his entered apprentice degree. What does he need to know before going through that door?
I actually tackle a little bit before they get into that room. I tell them the ceremonies are purely symbolic, and they are going to be exposed to a tsunami of symbols, biblical scriptures, philosophical statements, all presented to them in an allegorical form. Then I ask them, do you understand what allegorical means? And we get into that conversation. I tell them that there's going to be at least 2 more follow-up degrees that will drive home the points of the very first degree. If you didn't get the first degree, the second and third are going to drive home the points as to how important that first degree actually is. And you're going to be asked to take on an obligation. It's real simple. The obligation is going to cover 3 categories. One is it's going to give you an opportunity to commit to being a better man. And it's also going to give you an opportunity to commit to not ruining it for others who have yet to go through the degree.
Yeah.
You know, I keep on saying you don't want to tell the last chapter of a book when they haven't even started reading it. And the same thing goes to others that haven't gone through each of these degrees. Don't ruin it for them. And last but not least, you're going to be given an opportunity to commit to supporting your brothers as you would have expecting them to support you. And the last one, I love saying this because this one kind of blows the mind of candidates before they even get to that door. Anything in the degree that's designated as a secret is not a secret. And they look at me and say, what are you talking about? I say, you're being asked to treat specific things as if they were a secret. And this is to both develop and test your ability to be true to your word. And it's all internalization of specific disciplines. And the whole idea behind telling somebody it's a secret and telling them if it's a secret, you don't share it. I usually get smiles because the individuals who think that through recognize, wow, that makes so much sense.
Now, when I, talk with an EA, I say, I'm going to use your line and say the secrets line. I love that. But I always say to them, take everything that you have read or researched on Freemasonry, put it into a temporary folder in your brain, because tonight is your first experience into Freemasonry. And after this, I'm going to ask you what the one burning question is in your mind. And then we can have a whole discussion on everything else that's out there. But just enjoy it, and I'll see you on the other side of this door. And then I go take my position in the lodge, whatever that may be.
If they are curious enough to ask me, I say, there was something very special told to you in the entered apprentice degree that both points out your purpose and what you have to obtain in order for that purpose to even begin. The fellowcraft degree will give you the missing pieces if you're not aware of them already, and I leave it at that.
Then we get to the third degree, and I do prepare the candidate or brother a little bit more deeply in the third degree, much like I would in the first degree, letting them know, especially at one key part. And I think it's important that every lodge does this, because you just don't know. You don't know what this guy has been through in life and what could literally trigger him and set him off to where he could become violent in a defensive tactic because he felt threatened, right? So I think it's very important that let the brother know at the second half, you are portraying a part. Some things are going to be asked of you. Don't worry. No one's going to hurt you. It's all going to be good. And again, I'll see you on the other side, and we can talk about what this whole raising thing means to being a sublime master mason, because it's going to have a lot of different meanings, and I can't wait to have that conversation with you.
You're literally going to be carried through to the very end. So enjoy the ride.
I like that.
Well, thank you. That goes back to the root of the word tragedy and the drama and the indication of riding the goat.
Number 2.
Another first for the Craftsman Online podcast this year, an episode that involves performances from a guest. Worshipful brother Nathan St. Pierre was my guest for an episode on Masonic songs. Now, if you search Freemasonry songs on Google, you're going to get some pretty interesting results. On the second most listened to Craftsman Online podcast episode this year, Worshipful brother Nathan took us back to a time when music had a much larger role in Freemasonry.
The lodges were singing so many songs that it was getting published in the actual London newspapers, parodies of the Masonic songs being too loud when they were having their meetings up. Absolutely part and parcel of the same thing.
Here's the part that I found interesting, and throughout this podcast episode, we're going to share some examples of songs that you have found and recorded. So you'll hear her singing, and we'll break from time to time, so guys can get an idea of this. But we're not talking about singing the Star Spangled Banner, which is featured in some of the degree work in some jurisdictions. We're actually talking about songs that have to deal with Freemasonry. So who wrote these songs and where did they go?
So what's really funny is you mentioning the Star Spangled Banner, because the Star Spangled Banner actually is part of this same songwriting tradition that creates these Masonic songs, because the melody for the Star Spangled Banner comes from another song called To Anacreon in Heaven, which was the sort of big festival, here's how awesome we are. Really, it was a drinking song for the Anacreontic Society in England, and this there's a style of songwriting, or I shouldn't say style, I should say a practice of songwriting. That's a Latin word called contrafacta, and we all know what this is. Many of our elementary teachers, though, called them piggyback songs, right? It's where I'm going to take the melody for this one thing, and I'm going to change the words, and then it's going to become this other thing. And it's very familiar to people because, or maybe people don't even realize that Baba Black Sheep, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and the Alphabet Song all are the same melody, and that melody is Mozart, and that doesn't matter. That's not important. What is important is it was considered creative. It was considered moving something forward, to take a tune that everybody knew, add your own spin on it, add your own flavor, and then communicate that. Because what sometimes happened, and it actually sometimes happens now, is the sort of superimposed lyrics become more associated with that melody than even the original ones were. So the singing of the Star Spangled Banner, just to kind of swing all the way back, is part of that same tradition, because we have a national anthem that is a piece of contrafacta, because Francis Scott Key took the melody for To Anacreon in Heaven. He wrote his poem, right, in multiple verses for McHenry, right? And so it is continuing that practice of contrafacta. And in fact, it was so very common in my book chapter that I wrote on this. I talk about, there's a letter from Benjamin Franklin to his brother, where his brother had written a song, and Ben Franklin said, it's a shame that you wrote your own melody, because if you had just taken that very clever you had and to some other thing, then people might actually be singing your song. And it's, so by contemporary standards, we think that's very silly, because we no, we don't want the same thing, old hat. We want something new, come up with. But at that time, it was about taking the familiar and adding your own to it. In a way, music was a meme. And in fact, music is a meme. I do think that, and I use that in the Richard Dawkins way of a thought virus, right? So an internet meme that passes around is sort of the same way. It becomes funny because you're familiar familiar with what it's referencing. So when you add your own sort of sprinkles to it, it sticks better because you're like, oh yeah, I can relate to that. And what's interesting is upon further digging, because one of these, I think I shared it with you in the ones that we can sample. When to this confusion no end soon appeared, the sovereign grandmaster's word sudden was heard. Then teemed Mother Chaos with maternal throes, and so the grand lodge of this world arose. Derry down, 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 derry down, then heaven and earth with jubilee rung, and all the creation of masonry sung. But lo, to adorn and complete the gay ball, old Adam was made the grand master of all. Derry down, 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 derry down. Turns out that that's a very, very old English refrain that used to signal to the listener that what you're listening to is meant to be taken very tongue-in-cheek. And so it's an example of, so if Masons are taking that melody and then they're writing a song text over it, there's that hidden layer of, oh, and when they hear this, they're going to think, X, Y, or Z. In the same way that if you and I were to write a song about the New York Yankees and do it to the tune of Baby Shark, we might be playing on Baby Shark's kind of associated with the Nationals. And so there could be a narrative underneath of what's really happening. Meanwhile, at the surface, it's just, oh, they're just singing about the Nationals to the tune of Baby Shark.
And I can only imagine what it must have felt like for a brother to go to a lodge meeting then versus what it's like going to a lodge meeting now. And I'm not beating up modern Freemasonry because, things change and they evolve over time. But there seemed to be a lot more focus on the brotherhood aspect of Freemasonry, and music would you say, was kind of a working tool that was able to bring the brothers together that way?
What we say is harmony is the strength and support of all well-regulated institutions, especially this of ours, and that's monitored text. And we can say that, right? And it's because they really are driving into a very fundamental principle, and it goes back to Pythagoras, and we get Pythagorean ratio. Music was math. He didn't see them as different. Pythagoras was, he is our ancient friend and brother. He saw music as the language of creation. And come back to Kirk McNulty, when he talks about the 7 liberal arts and sciences, he talks about rearranges the order. You need grammar to get to rhetoric because you need to learn words before you can argue with them. And then once you can say something, then now I'm going to persuade you. Now I have drama, so now I have rhetoric, right? And so in the same way, you start with mathematics, and then geometry is math in space, and then when we get to music, that's math in time. And then when we get to astronomy, that's math in space. So everything is built on the first one. And so that's why actually music is right up there with astronomy. And so kind of fun is in the 1600s, Johannes Kepler, he did some math out because he was a big Pythagoras guy. And he was like, I think Pythagoras was onto something with these ratios. And he did some math out and he found that the orbits of matched Pythagoras's intervals pretty closely, right? Because Pythagoras took that one step further and said, well, if there's harmony on earth, there must be harmony in heaven. So that's where we get the idea of the harmony of the spheres, okay? So the harmony of the spheres was an actual philosophy or belief that in the same way that when you move something on earth, it makes sound because sound is simply vibration. Well, since the moving, they must be making a sound. Well, we can't hear the sound that they make because it's so big. So what sound is it? Well, it must be similar to the sounds that we hear on Earth because the math is what the math is. Now, I should point out that Kepler was later proven wrong, but it still, is worth pointing out that here's an astronomer, right? That's the top of our ladder of the sciences, right? But he's building on the idea of Pythagoras, who was speaking from music.
And we've landed at the top spot on our countdown.
Number 1.
Deep in the first degree of Freemasonry, you'll find the historical lecture. This section of the degree is a compilation of 7 lectures that were written by William Preston during the 18th century that are jam-packed with deep, esoterical, and practical explanations of how Freemasonry, Masonic lodges, and Brethren are all pulled together. And that's where my guest really shines as a bright star in ritual. Brother Matthew Brockbank jumped on for the Enter the Apprentice episode as we unpacked that historical lecture in the most listened to Craftsman Online podcast episode for 2023. Brother Matt speaks to his experience in delivering words that were written almost 200 years ago to a whole new generation of Freemasons. I'll never forget my historical lecture because you gave it.
Oh.
And I remember, what goes through, and we've talked some about this in previous seasons, the experience as an EA is that you come into a lodge, especially the night that you're going to be taking that EA degree, and you have, I would say, in your mind, your own file of what you think Freemasonry is about, whether it's the research you've done on your own that could wander off into some of the conspiracy theories or some of the historical part, or maybe some of the esoteric, if you can grasp all of that. And you just have tons of questions. And then you come in, and that initiatic experience is, unless you've gone through a college fraternity, maybe there would have been some of that
Little crossover, yeah.
But for the most part, you're like, okay, this is completely different. Even if I read the Masonry for Dummies book and was kind of prepped on what's going to happen, you don't really experience it fully until you go through it. And then the historical lecture happens. And at that point, I do remember, because I just sat there and I was like, okay, here's this young guy, and he must really be into Freemasonry, because he's getting up and he's talking about all these things, and he's walking around the lodge and pointing out to all these places. And I was like, wow, and he's just talking extemporaneously. And it wasn't until you used a couple of words that are in Old English where I'm like, wait a second, these aren't his words. Like,
That's great.
he's memorized. He's delivering this from memory.
At first, I memorized it. I learned it cold, and that's what I think most good ritualists should do: is take the piece as it is written and learn it cold. That's got to be the first step, so that you can kind of understand it. And if you can give it basically to yourself in a mirror, then you can perform your duty as a brother to give that part. But then once you memorize it and you're comfortable reciting it, then you can start to kind of put your own spin on things. And this is where I'm going to get in trouble with all the ritualist purists out there. But I don't think that it needs to be word for word, and I'll get into that in a second, because sometimes I drop a word here, or I change the order of a few words over there, because it flows better, in my opinion. And again, that's just my opinion. I know a lot of folks see my father very much as a ritual purist to an extent, and I am a little bit, but I don't think that word for word memorization makes you a good ritualist. I think most of our ritualists, or rituals, I should say, I especially think that this one, as well as the Middle Chamber, like you said, and just the Hiramic legend in general, are and should be performative. And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying you should rewrite the lecture, as like a hip hop album, but, I'm sure we would love that, and I would pay to see it, certainly. But what I mean is you should put your own spin on it, because we can all recite something. If you try hard enough, we can all eventually get there. That's easy. Worst case scenario, you could read it right from the book, if you had to. But a good ritualist, I think, engages the audience. And, this is a 20 to 30 minute monologue. I got to do something, to keep these candidates' attention and, prevent, older folks like my dad from falling asleep. But, they just went through a very long ordeal. Half of it, they are hoodwinked. And, I could probably rant for another hour about ritual performance, but I could probably save that for a whole nother episode. But basically, to put a bow on it, I use my time to engage not just the new brothers, but the rest of the craft, because some of these people travel very far to see St. George's put on a degree. And, not to toot our horn, but we take a lot of pride in it, and I think that's something that we really do well. And it's not just me. I mean, everyone. It's a whole degree. And I'm not even like 10% of the degree. It's a lot of other people. They do a great job. So you probably remember, when I talk about the pillar of beauty, usually I single out a brother. I'll make a face. I'll get a laugh or two. If I refer to like Cowens and eavesdroppers, I'll give a wink or a nod to somebody in the room. And if I see my dad sitting in the north, which we Masonically term a place of darkness, I get a laugh out of that. So those are moments that usually get a chuckle. And I think that's great because at the end of the day, I want to engage everybody, brothers, new and old, and get them excited about ritual. So, hopefully it drives and, motivates other people to say, hey, wow, this ritual is actually kind of cool. Yeah, this could be neat. I could do that. And then, we see where it goes from there.
Do you kind of find your vein to be less acting out the ritual and more just kind of trying to embody the words?
Yeah, I do try to embody the words a lot. That is important to me because I think the words are very powerful. And I think that the message in those words is important. So when I do emphasize and when I really kind of stress certain sentences or words, I definitely, think about what is this piece of work, what is this art trying to say, and how do I do that, and how do I do it well, and how do I get engagement, and how do I really drive that point home? You can listen to it 100 times, but I didn't understand a lot of the first 3 historical lecture until I gave it. And it was only after giving it that it was like, oh my God.
Yeah. I would agree with you is that we do our biggest learning in Freemasonry when we prepare to share that experience of the degree with the next guy. And that's when I really studied those words and was like, wow, this is what Matthew was talking about. I was really blown away with your mannerisms and how you were walking around, the personality. And I was listening to the words, but as you kind of pointed out, like was really getting into reading between those lines that meant something to me. So I'm just curious, we've mentioned with kind of broad brushstrokes, but are there particular sections of the historical lecture that you almost get excited to get ready to share because they're your favorite part?
Absolutely. Again, I don't know how much time we have here, but
much as you need.
Yeah. My very favorite part, though, is probably the end of the lecture. Maybe just because I've been talking for 30 minutes straight. No, I think as this lecture was first written and later revised, I would say that the end, the very last section, is just pure poetry. It's how an entered apprentice should serve his master. And it just, like every part of it just hits. And it's good because, it follows the rule of 3, which is great. But, at the very end, I think really the cherry on top of this entire cake, and I'm talking like from the very first part of the historical lecture, this is the very last, kind of chunk. It's just perfect. Nothing is more zealous than clay, our Mother Earth, for it alone of all elements has never proved unfriendly to man. Though harassed more for the luxuries than the necessities of life, she never refuses her yield, strewing our pathways with flowers and spreading our tables with plenty. Though she produces poison, still she furnishes the antidote, and returns with interest every good entrusted to her care. And when at last you are called to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, she once more receives us, and tenderly enfolds our remains within her bosom, thus admonishing us that from earth we came, so to earth we must surely return. Chef's kiss.
And that's a wrap. As we close out this year, I want to acknowledge the working group at Craftsman Online, who are the brothers behind the scenes that really drive the production of this weekly podcast. If you'll indulge me for just a few seconds, I want to say thanks to Brother Todd Paterick, our social media manager who takes care of all of the posts on our Facebook and Instagram accounts. Also want to say thank you to Worshipful Brother Jason Lee, officially my 15th favorite guest on the podcast, but really one of our biggest fans. And I also want to thank all of the guests who came on and made this season so special. You're the real star, and without your insight and passion, well, I probably wouldn't have made it past season 1. And finally, big thanks to Right Worshipful Stephen Adam Rubin, my co-founder and friend. Brother Steve is the biggest promoter of the Craftsman Online podcast, constantly bringing it up throughout all of his visits and lodges in New York and around the world, as well as our executive guest producer extraordinaire. Brother Steve, I just want to say personally, thank you for stepping up and serving as an example on how to lead the way. And with that, I'm going to enjoy some of my younger brother David's homemade eggnog and wish all of you a very joyous New Year. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.